It's an honor to introduce Bill this morning. Bill is married to Jean Roth. Jean is a Buckeye, and so is Bill. Bill grew up in Ohio, so did Jean, so they're still Ohio State fans. Number 4, just for your information. They have 2 children. William is in the DC area working for the Department of Commerce, and Elizabeth is a stay-at-home mother, but also is an editor and is helping Bill on a book that he is working on. He'll probably say more about that. You may notice that, or some of you already know, that Bill has had some vision issues. So if he sees your hand if he doesn't see your hand going up in the air, don't worry, he probably won't be able to capture in his vision your hand in the air. But we are really pleased to have Bill with us this morning. I looked on the website to see what it is that Bill does at JMU. There's a lot there, and I'll only read a little bit. As far as his department, it says, exploring the big question with us. In courses with our award-winning faculty, you will learn to analyze arguments, interpret texts, weigh diverse perspectives, and communicate persuasively in written and oral form. You will develop your own well-reasoned approaches to some of humanity's deepest questions, but you will also dialogue with ideas and traditions that may be foreign to you. You will gain skills in critical thinking and cross-cultural understanding that you can apply to a wide variety of career fields and paths of impact. Bill came to EMU in about 2000 or 2001, and after 3 years went to JMU. And I hear nothing but good things from students that have had him as a teacher. I thought I would conclude in my introduction of Bill by reading some things that his students, have said about him on the website. All universities, schools have the ability for a student to go online and evaluate their professor. After reading, there are no negatives. After reading 40, and there were still many more, I chose 5 to read a few of them. Dr. Hawk is one of the most passionate and respected teachers I've had. His lectures are so thought-provoking and interesting. Student 2, Dr. Hawk is an amazing professor. He is so kind and inspiring. He is very passionate about philosophy and making boring material very interesting. He even hosts a final exam review at his house with pizza and drink. We won't ask what the drink is. Soda and water. Third, Dr. Hawk is an incredible and inspiring man. He deeply cares for his students, which you can see especially during a review session for the final exam. Dr. Hawk is a very engaging and respectful professor. He thoroughly explains all of the information presented in class and makes sure all students know what's required from them. He is willing to meet with you after class if you need extra help. I love the class material. And the last one, he was my favorite teacher this semester. He really cares about the students and asks for feedback on how to make his class better. I would definitely take his class again. Those are only 5 examples of many that are on the website. Bill, it's an honor to have you here this morning at ACRS. Welcome.
Thanks, Mark. first introduction using Rate My Professor. That's unexpected. Thank you very much, Terry. Did Ohio State win this weekend?
They didn't play.
They didn't play. Well, that's good. Okay. It's good to be here. Thank you very much. I know there are many people here that I know, probably many that I can't see right now. For those of you who don't know, 7 years ago, 2 days ago, I had my 4th retina surgery, which was unsuccessful, on my left eye, where I had a retinal tear. And so I have basically very little vision in my left eye. And I have in my right eye, I have vision, but I don't have any central vision, so I can't, because I had what was called a macular tear when I was deaning at EMU many years ago. So I do get around difficultly. I don't recognize faces very well. I can't read my library, which is a problem, and I can't drive. But I have a dear wife who's here with me who helps me get around. And when I work at JMU, they have a lot of assistive technologies now that help me do the work that I do. Mostly I do workshops. I teach class. We do workshops on campus and off campus, all of which have to do with the same theme, which is an ethical reasoning process that we have developed at JMU. It's interesting because EMU is going to go through their SAC-COC accreditation in the near term, it sounds like. The project that I'm introducing to you today is one that came out of JMU's SAC-COC process 7 years ago. There was an effort on campus to come up with something distinctive that we could do at the university. There were proposals coming in from all over the university. 77 proposals were introduced. And what I'm going to present to you today was the one that became the finalist. We've been working on it now for 7 years. I thought about this, and this is, do I have this? Yes. Interesting, this is how I would do a workshop with deans or accountants or mediators or whatever, some title, something like this. I thought I would change a little bit in terms of the title that I want to give this morning, which is Politics of Jesus, Meet James Madison. And I think there's something important about putting those two things together. The Politics of Jesus, I'm putting you here as a metaphor for sort of the Mennonite life, not just a book, but sort of an attitude toward the world. And I'm putting that, sort of juxtaposing that with James Madison, who in interesting ways shared some important things and values of the politics of Jesus. 1789, when the Bill of Rights was first introduced in Congress, the first 10 amendments had to do with separation of church and state. And the politics of Jesus, as a sort of sociological analysis of the Mennonite community, has sort of thrived on that kind of distinction and separation. So I want to talk a little bit about that commonality, and then some of the differences between what the Mennonite community, as I understand it, so I'm something of an outsider, what the Mennonite community has done versus what the politics of what James Madison has done, and see if there isn't some place where we can come together. So that's what I'm going to try to do. And by the way, this is all experimental for me because I don't usually do workshops like this or talks like this. One of the main themes out of the politics of Jesus has to do with this passage from Philippians, which I think many of us know. It talks about sort of the basic disposition toward the world in terms of our political life and maybe in terms of our ethical life, as given by Apostle Paul in reference to Jesus, who, though Jesus had every right to claim to be God, put that aside, put reputation aside, took on the attitude of a servant, and as a servant, took a different disposition toward the world. Not a sort of high, powerful position of authority, but a position of actually trying to serve others. And so that's an important passage, I think, for the politics of Jesus of the Mennonite community. How we as Mennonites, or those of us who try to identify as Mennonites, or those of us who are married to a Mennonite, how we try to serve the world. And we have, as a Mennonite community, there's a really strong kind of history there that shows how that's been done. And I'm going to give you some examples. For the most part, it's been acceptable to be a preacher of the gospel. in the Mennonite community. Clearly, it's been an important part to be a peacemaker. And I was talking to Vernon Jansen here a second ago, I'm thinking about, oh yeah, that's sort of the, one of the instances to show that that's an important way to be a Christian in the world as understood from the point of view of the politics of Jesus. Or maybe even being involved in relief services, or coming from a history from farming, or from teaching, or from medicine. Those kinds of ways in which we actually directly serve human beings when they're in need. Some of these carry with them a kind of message about the importance of Jesus, the importance of Christianity. Some of them are simply a matter of service, direct service. Looking for no reputation, simply being someone who serves. But some of the places where this hasn't happened so much are places that I work. And I think in terms of, there's been a kind of reluctance or worry about doing things that involve rational thoughts and reasoning and those kinds of things. If you listen to Terry's introduction, you find out that I do that stuff. That's what I do for a living. There's been a kind of worry about ethics, and I think there's an undercurrent in the book, The Politics of Jesus, that worries about, well, we have to have a separate ethics. Because the ethics of the world is different than the ethics of the politics of Jesus. And there's also concern about political life. And so throughout most of history, at least in the United States, the Mennonite community has been sort of on the side of political life. And you find out that my son is now an economist who works for the Department of Commerce, and he's pretty thoroughly engaged in political life at one level, not at the partisan politics level, but at the life of policy making, which has to do with how we actually organize our society. So we've actually, my family at least in some respects, has moved away from the usual ways of doing it. What I want to suggest is, I don't think there's really anything incompatible with engaging in rational thought, or engaging in a kind of common ethic, or in political life, between folks who are trying to follow that injunction from Paul about putting aside your reputation and being a servant. In fact, from my perspective, I think that all of us in this room as Mennonite Anabaptists could do more, going beyond preaching the gospel, doing peacemaking, doing service work of one kind or another, teaching medicine or farming, to help people make better decisions. That's the work that I do. And I have a whole group of colleagues that work with me on this at the university. We have a program that we run across the university so that all of our incoming students actually get introduced to this kind of process of ethical reasoning when they come on campus. And I see that as a kind of carrying out of that injunction from Paul to be a servant. My service is, I don't help you raise a better crop, I don't help you medically, that would be nice if I could do that. I don't help you necessarily as a teacher, I help you, or we help you, make better decisions. And I think the Mennonite community who wants to follow this politics of Jesus could do a lot more in this in terms of helping people make better decisions. Not being afraid of being rational and thinking through things and being policy-oriented and being economically oriented, not being afraid of being sociologically oriented, actually being involved in the world, but bringing up distinctively different attitude, disposition, set of values. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And by the way, if you have any questions along the way, just raise your hand or yell so that I can hear you, and we'll go with the questions. My passage that I'm using is not from the Gospels or from the Bible. My passage is from Milton's Paradise Lost. And the passage is a passage in which God is explaining why it is that human beings have fallen. Why it is that human beings have sinned or made bad decisions, bad choices, bad behaviors. And what part of the passage here I think is important is, first of all, God explains that human beings seem to be ungrateful because God has given humanity all God could to make us as much like God as we possibly could be, and then says, I made him just and right, sufficient to have stood, but able to fall, free to fall. And this actually goes against a sort of doctrine that I was taught at one time in my career about what we call original sin. And the idea that I was taught about original sin was that original sin is something that we inherit almost biologically, or as a metaphysical claim about us. And I think that's a misinterpretation of at least what I understand to be how human beings are created. We aren't metaphysically fallen. We are fallen by choice. And it's a choice for each and every one of us every time. It's not a matter of I am prone to do these things and I can't avoid it. I could avoid it. And in fact, what I think is sort of the metaphysical view of original sin is a grand kind of justification or rationalization of why we do so many bad things. And I think we have no justification or rationalization for why we do bad things, other than we make bad choices. And that's what we work with at JMU, that we try to avoid bad choices. We try to avoid bad choices by having our choices be better informed. The way that we justify things is make the fantastic title of this book, Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Me. It's how we, as human beings, we have this disposition sort of built into us to rationalize what we've done. And when we've done bad things, we come up with ways to explain why we did them, so that they weren't so bad after all. It seems to me that's part of the human condition, to rationalize and justify what we've done. Mistakes were made, but not by me. The examples I give at the beginning of this book, by the way, are Henry Kissinger, who was actually being asked about war crimes. And Henry Kissinger said something to the effect, during the administration in which I served, there may have been mistakes. But of course, when he was serving in that administration, he was the most powerful person up to the president, giving advice to the president. But there may have been mistakes. There also is an example of a priest who was apparently not investigating the pedophilia in his own group. And he said, if there were mistakes made, I deeply apologize. There were mistakes made. There were decisions that were made that were really bad decisions. There were decisions that were made that could have been avoided or could have been better. It's not a matter of a metaphysical disposition. People made bad choices. And what we have to do is to recognize that that's what we do. Original sin is not a metaphysical claim. It's a descriptive claim. It's an empirical claim. And so the question is, what can we do to follow that admonition from Paul in the Philippians, to put apart our reputation, take on the attitude of the servant, and do that with respect to important things like how people choose. That's what we're working with. In background to the work that I've done, and I'll say this in an interesting way because I don't have this odd idea that my legal blindness was a kind of gift. I don't think of it as a gift. I think it was a kind of disability. And so I don't have a sort of naive, positive view about it. But a result of my legal blindness was that for 3 periods, 4 surgeries, I was face down for 24/7 for about 10 days at a time. And because my eye was filled with the gas had to push up against the retina, trying to make it flat, and then your eye fills up with its own fluid again. And during that time, I took on the habit of listening to books. And one of the books I listened to was a book by Jonah Lehrer, who became discredited later because he plagiarized from himself. But Jonah Lehrer wrote a book on How We Decide. And I also listened to a book by Malcolm Gladwell. The book was called Blink. It has to do how we make really quick, intuitive decisions. And following upon that this experience, which was about a 6 to 8 month period, I started listening to more books because I couldn't read books anymore. And unfortunately or fortunately, there are a lot of philosophy books that haven't been turned into audible books. And I'm not sure why, because they could be interesting. But the books that are out there that I found interesting was the research for the last 40 years on how human beings make decisions. And by the way, there has been a revolution of research on how people make decisions. The leading book on the field is done by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. And in that book, he writes about the research that he and his colleague, Amos Tversky, did on human decision making. The model used by economists to talk about how to make predictive analyses of the future, that we are rational, turns out to be not quite the case. We make a lot of choices that aren't rational. Most of our choices are made quickly, intuitively, without much deliberation or reflection. And Kahneman and Tversky did all this fascinating research, which sort of goes against the standing prevailing model that human beings are rational, that we are utility maximizers, that we make choices in our own best interests. We don't always make choices. We don't always make rational choices. We tend to make quick, intuitive choices. That's true not just for people who are trying to follow the politics of Jesus, but for everyone. Human beings have this kind of disposition toward making decisions quickly and intuitively. That's true for important decisions like ethics as well. And basically what happens with our decision making in ethics is we make decisions based on the ethics that we've been taught. And if we happen to have been taught in a nice community where people are nice to each other, our dispositions are nice, our intuitions are nice. But if that's not the case, our dispositions aren't quite that way, but we tend to go with them whatever they are because we take them to be the only thing we know to be right. We do surveys of our incoming students, 17, 18-year-old students, about how confident they are to make good ethical choices. 80-some% of them are very confident. Now, if you listen to the news about what college students do these days, you think, wow, that doesn't quite jive with what I hear. But people are confident about their own ethics. It's the other guy that's the problem. Other people don't do so. So we've got this research out there, and I started listening to all this research. And by the way, all of these books are on Audible. If you're going for a long drive somewhere and you want to listen to some of these books. You look at Dan Ariely, who's a behavioral economist down at Duke, who does this stuff on being predictably irrational. And he does stuff that has an interesting impact on ethics as well. He does this, I sometimes show this video, but he does this research that shows people cheating. And there's a lot of good cheating research out there. And they have designed an experiment to actually put people in a position to give them the opportunity to cheat. And what they do is they pass out sheet paper to everyone. The sheet of paper has on it 20 boxes, and each box has 9 different numbers, and each one of those boxes has 2 numbers that are complementary to 10, meaning that if you add them together, they actually come up to 10. And it's a one number with 2 decimal points, and you have to come up. It takes you a little while to figure out which 2 actually get to 10. And what you do is you get paid for the number of correct answers you get in a 5-minute time period. And so what they have to do is they have people do these little tests. They give them 5 minutes. They come to the front of the room. They take their paper, put it in a shredder, and then they all report how many they got right. Which means they know they can't be found to have given a false statement. And so sometimes they do this and they leave, they give their report, and what happens is that on average people can get 4 right, but they report 6. And the question is, well, how do you know that on average people can get 4 right? It's because the shredder they have has been fixed. It shreds only the edges of the paper. So they actually get the actual paper back, and they compare that to what's been reported at an aggregate level. So they know how much cheating can take place. Average 4 accurately, they actually reported 6. They paid them $1 for correct answer. These are mostly college students. Sometimes they give them 50 cents, sometimes they give them $2, sometimes they give them $10 for correct report. And what they found is, the interesting thing, that the amount of money they get paid does not alter the amount of cheating. Now, an economist will tell you there's an opportunity cost lost there if you didn't cheat more when you got more. But because we're rational, the model is that I would try to cheat a little bit more. But actually what happens is when they pay $10 for a correct report, cheating goes down. And the question that Ariely raises is, why is that? And his answer is, it's because we have two kind of forces within us. One is, we want to benefit a little bit from cheating. And the other one is that we don't want to cheat too much because it changes our self-perception. We want to be able to face ourselves in the mirror and say, I'm not a cheater. And they've done lots of studies to show the same kind of phenomenon. Human beings want to be able to perceive themselves as being ethical. They've done this in this fascinating study, which I think is really relevant to the kind of thing I'm talking about with this Philippians passage. They give half the people, before they have this matrix test, half the people are told, write down 10 books you read in high school. And the other half of the people are told to write down the 10 Commandments. And Ariely reports kind of funnily, no one knows all 10 Commandments, but that doesn't make any difference. Even those people who are atheists are asked to write down the 10 Commandments. What they find is, the people who are asked to write down 10 books that they read in high school, they cheat normally. The people who are asked to write down the 10 Commandments don't cheat. Simply being reminded of ethical considerations reduces the amount of cheating, reduces it significantly, by the way. And that's an interesting phenomenon on this. Intuitively, we go along kind of making quick decisions without thinking about them until we're reminded of our ethics. And the ethics then actually has an effect on how we actually behave. Research like that across the board, all kinds of interesting things. If you are looking for something to read that is really difficult to read but really powerful, read the little article on the left by Jonathan Haidt, who's a social psychologist who's now at NYU, called The Emotional Dog and Its Rational Tail. And what Haidt shows is that most of us, most of the time, when we make ethical decisions, make quick, intuitive decisions, and then we use our moral reasoning to justify that decision. Most of our moral considerations, most of the allusions we make to whatever moral compass we follow, is after the fact of already having made the choice. And we use it to justify what the choice was. That's how we operate. That's not original sin, but it's a good condition for it. It creates the condition in which what we're likely to do is to go with what we've been taught and then make a justification for it, rather than to investigate what the best choice would be. Okay. Let me give you 2 examples. Both of these are unfortunate examples. 2 years ago, this coming Friday, there were 5 young high school kids up near Flint, Michigan, a small town called Clio, Michigan. They got together with a friend. The guy's name was Angler, who was the oldest of these high school kids. And they did apparently something that was done on a routine basis. It's called overpassing. They took rocks, put them in the back of the truck of this young, the oldest of these young Mr. Angler. And they put rocks in the back of the truck, went to an overpass over Interstate 75 in Michigan, and threw rocks on cars. One of those rocks was an 8-pound rock thrown by Mr. Angler that killed a passenger in an oncoming van. Since then, those 5 young men, I think I've got their ages here, have been in jail, waiting for prosecution. They had come up with a plea bargain for 4 of them, the ones who didn't throw the rock, treating them as juveniles, but the judge threw it out. He said, we're going to treat you as adults. These 5 young men have been in jail since October the 14th, I think that's the date, 2017, waiting with their decision about how they're going to be tried. There on the left, the person on the right is the father of 4 who was killed by this, what they would call a prank. And the prosecutor said, it's no prank when someone who's 34 years old, the father of 4, gets killed. This is no prank. One kind of decision. And what do we think? Wow, this is just a stupid, dumb idea. This is not malicious intent. This is not evil people. A bunch of high school guys who didn't think through what they were doing. This reminded me of what actually helped me make the proposal at JMU for the program we're doing right now, which was when my son, who some of you know from Community Midnight, went to college. He went to Mary Washington College. And he was doing a year of service at a Catholic worker house in San Antonio, Texas. And he didn't have time, he said, to go through the process of applying for different schools. So he gave a call to his mom and dad and said, you two know a lot more about colleges than I do. Pick one for me. By the way, which is not that easy to do for someone else. So we picked 2, and we visited 2, and they ended up going to Mary Washington. And I thought to myself after I left him off there, what do I hope he majors in? And I thought, I really don't care what he majors in. I hope he majors in something he enjoys, something he might be good at. What I really care about is that going off to college, he doesn't make any really bad decisions. You can make bad decisions in college that will ruin the rest of your life. And I thought to myself, who at Mary Washington is going to help him make good decisions? And for the life of me, I couldn't think of who that would be. So I thought, well, maybe when this thing for the QEP at JMU came through, maybe we could actually work with college students on making good decisions. My version of service, helping people make good decisions, is just as good sometimes as giving them a cup of cold water. And so that's how our program began, based on my worry about my own son and making decisions. And my worry about the students I have in my class, because I've taught for ethics probably for 30 years on and off, with some administrative things in the middle. And my worry is that my students make good choices. And I'm not sure that by teaching them moral theory, they make good choices. I'm not sure that by teaching them philosophy and religion, they make good choices. I'm not sure that by teaching them ethics of all kinds, they make good choices. This came to me after I started listening to these books about how we actually make decisions, about the research about how we make decisions. That's one example. Next example comes from this author named Eugene Soltesz, who teaches the Harvard Business School. So it's sort of a different level of decision making. And what Eugene Soltesz did was interview 48 white-collar criminals who were in prison. These are 48 all white males, all wealthy at one point in their lives, all high-powered in various corporate positions. And he interviewed them to ask, why did you or how did you end up in prison? What he determined was, the common answer was, they made a choice and they just didn't think it through. It was quick, intuitive, they said the pressures were on, and I just didn't think about what the consequences might be for the choice I made. It could have been Sam Waxel, who actually called a couple of friends about a negative FDA report that's going to come out on his Implone pharmaceutical, and told them, you ought to sell your stock, which will send you to prison. Or it could have been an accountant for WorldCom, who actually, what they did was they fixed the books and they created a kind of cost that wasn't a real cost so that they could actually come up with a quarterly earning report that was positive. Because WorldCom had this idea, they wanted to make greater and greater earnings every quarter. Went to prison also. And what Soltesz found out is that these are not bad people. And these are not underprivileged people, and they're not 16-year-old high school kids. These were men in powerful positions who made bad choices. The basis for the choices that Soltesz identifies are these. One, people didn't realize or didn't recognize that the choice they were about to make had significant consequences, had results far beyond the immediate choice they were about to make. Two, when they made the choice, there were usually, if they involved anyone else, there were people who were already like them, who didn't bring in any sort of outsider perspective. They had not enough dissonance in their perspective taking. And three, when they finally had to make the choice, they often went with what their immediate intuition was, not with the results of any deliberation or process. This came out after we started our program, but our program actually addresses all three of these. The program of helping people make better decisions is not to tell you what decision to make. I distrust those folks. But to tell you how to make a better informed choice. So that's what we're trying to do. We know that, for the most part, there's a lot of research on this, by the way, that the efforts to try to help people make better choices isn't solved by classrooms. There is, Jonathan Haidt says, I've yet to find any evidence of any course that actually improves people making better ethical choices. It's not solved by codes. A lot of professions have ethical codes, but usually the codes are consulted after people have already made the choice and trying to figure out how they can actually work around the choice they've made. And it's not solved by crackdowns. It's not solved by enforcement and punishment. People aren't deterred because they just don't see the consequences of what they're doing. So if that's the case, what can we do as people who want to be servants to those around us who actually look for a better strategy for making choices? At least that's been my experience. People say, well, do your students want to do something like you're doing with ethics? They love it. People want to make better choices. All of us want to be able to look ourselves in the mirror and think, I did the right thing. We tried to do this, I couldn't do it, but there was this kind of study that was done, this all from the background of what we do. It's called the Selective Attention Study, and it involves a process in which there are two different teams. One team has white shirts, the other team has black shirts. And you're asked to watch this video, and what they're doing is they're passing basketballs to each other. And I want a show of hands. How many of you have seen this? What you have to do is count the basketball passes from the white team. How many of you have seen this? A lot of you haven't seen this. Okay. I will tell you how it goes, and if you want to sometime, you can look it up online. It's Chris Chabris and someone named Simmons. They did this called Selective Attention Study. And what they said to do is they asked observers like you to count the number of basketball passes from the white team. And they do that, and in the midst of this is a spoiler, in the midst of this, while the basketball passes are being passed, a person in a gorilla outfit walks into the middle of the room, pounds her chest, and walks away. And the fascinating thing is, more than 50% of the people who watch the video don't see the gorilla. They don't see the gorilla, and you think that can't be the case. But look at some other Chabris studies where they actually do other kinds of things where people just miss obvious things that are going on because they're paying attention to the counting basketball passes. Dan Kahneman, who uses this book, and by the way, the blind spots books that I put up there as one of the resources, uses that story as sort of the story of all of us. We miss really important things. It's called we miss the obvious. Dan Kahneman says we learn two things: that we're blind to the obvious, and that we're blind to our blindness. I don't like blind references anyway. But the interesting thing about that is the research that's come out of that is actually talking about how it is we miss stuff. And what we do is to take that same study and flip its interpretation. One thing to recognize is that we're blind to the obvious because we miss the gorilla. And that we're blind to our blindness. That is true. We just don't know what we don't know. But I think the important lesson here is that when we're asked a question, we focus our attention on the question and not on the things around the question. There's an economist at the London School of Economics who says that this whole gorilla selective attention study has been misinterpreted because it focuses on what you miss. What you should focus on is the power of the question. The power of the question, how many basketball passes are here? You can miss everything else. And so what we do in the process, the group that I work with at JMU, is we actually focus on the questions. If your problem is you tend to miss information, look for the kind of information you should get. If the problem is you're going around the world and you don't see signs of grace or justice, look for them. Don't go to the news at night, which I sometimes do, and just get disgruntled. Go to your life and try to find things that are positive. Ask yourself the right questions. Are there signs of grace going on here? Are there signs of peace and justice going on here? Look for those, because that will be what you see. So what we're doing is using questions to actually help us with our decision making when it comes to ethics. There are other models for this that are out there. The journalists ask who, what, when, where, why, and how. An attorney who is actually doing negligence cases, when the person comes into the office and says, I want to sue, they say, was there a duty? Was the duty breached? Did the breach cause a harm? Is the harm compensable? And can you get money for it? Those 4 questions. If it's yes to all 4, and the compensability is high enough, you take the case. Or another case where we use a series of questions is with respect to newborns. In the 1950s, there was a woman by the name of Virginia Apgar, who was an anesthesiologist actually, and she had the lowest, or her group had the lowest infant mortality rate in a hospital in Boston. They asked her, why do we have such a low infant mortality rate? She said, when a baby is born, I look for these 5 things. These are not the things she said then, but what has happened is they created a backronym using her name. I look for appearance. I look for P. I look for blood, pulse, thank you. I look for a grimace response. I look for activity. I look for respiration. And then out of that came something called an APGAR test, or an APGAR score. And when babies are born, they look for those 5 things. They get scored 0 to 2 on each one of those features. If the score is 4 or below, that means that baby needs immediate attention. If the score is 8 to 10, that means this baby's probably going to be fine. And the one scores between there, means you need attention, but it's not an emergency attention. What happens is by asking for these 5 things for a new baby, babies' lives are saved. Your journalism is better made. What, when, where, why, how. You can actually win a successful negligence case if you ask duty, breach, causation, compensability. What we have done at JMU in an effort to try to help make people make better decisions is to come up with that kind of set of questions for ethics. Which, by the way, is a bold move. Because how can you teach ethics? Well, we don't teach ethics. We teach ethical reasoning. We teach you to remind yourself and others of important ethical considerations that you need to use before you make a choice. And not just go with what comes to you automatically from your gut or your intuition or your past. Okay. So that's what we're doing. Would you? And I know some of you have these from the past, but what we do is when we bring in all 4,400 incoming students at JMU in the fall, in August this year, we have them do the first and only academic activity they do at the university is an ethical reasoning activity. And we pass out to them our 8 key questions ethical reasoning cards. And we give them, and I can't go to this because I can't get to the Wi-Fi here, but if you go online and you look up overdose, JMU, which is the scenario we developed for this year. It has to do with the opioid overdose epidemic. We did one the previous 3 years on an outbreak of a communicable disease, the Ebola, actually. And the 3 years before that, we did rescue and recovery after a hurricane. That was Hurricane Sandy that prompted that one. But what we do is we try to take events out of life and create a situation and give students an opportunity to actually engage in an ethical reasoning process. The process goes like this. When you face a challenging question, by the way, most of us face some kind of challenging questions. And a lot of us face questions having to do with finances, or having to do with our political opinions, or having to do with health issues. And so the question is, how do we actually face those? And what we can do is go with sort of what we've been taught all the way through, or we can actually come up with a strategy. When you face a challenging question, you should ask yourself the following questions. First, and these are not in order of priority, the order in creating, we had to create a mnemonic for our strategy because 8 things are too hard apparently for people to remember off the top of their heads. Although we're pretty good at 7 days a week, we're pretty good at 12 months of the year. And it takes a while for us to come up with 8 things. First thing is question of fairness. Is it? Thank you very much. And I have till 9. 8:59. Okay, thank you. Ask the question of fairness. What's a fair thing to do? What's the just thing to do, the ethical thing to do? The term is, it's not to sort of pick on that term. We pick that term because we think it's the most accessible term that actually creates an association with other terms of fairness. And what we do is we say, just remember to be fair. We tend to actually look out for our own self-interest. We tend to look out for the interests of our group. We tend to look out for the interests of those people we identify with. Try to be fair for everyone. Think about being fair. Second, think about the outcomes. What are the outcomes, the results, the consequences, or if you're a utilitarian, you know this is actually a utility question. What's going to happen as a result of what I do? And one strategy we use is, what's going to happen in 10 days, 10 months, 10 years as a result of what I do? Think about it as fast as you can, as well as you can, all the permutations of what might come from what you're about to do. Think about those consequences. Tough to do. My example of how hard that is to quote Don Rumsfeld, who was Secretary of Defense, who was interviewed right after the invasion of Iraq by the Allied forces back in 2002, I think it was, something like that. He was asked, how long do you think this war will last with Iraq? He said 6 days, 6 weeks. I doubt 6 months. The war in Iraq lasted a lot longer than that, 11 years or something, if you count it to the final peace decision. Ask yourself the question of responsibility. Are there any special responsibilities or any general responsibilities here? We owe each other duties simply because something is due to that other person. And we owe that to no matter what human being we encounter. Things are due to them. We also create kind of our own special obligations. I oblige myself to things, like being a husband and being a father and being an employee of JMU and being a citizen of the United States and being a member of a community. I create kind of obligations. So think through all the possible responsibilities that might be in play. Fourth, ask yourself the character question. What action is the action that I want to become, a sort of defining action of who I am to become? The person I aspire to be. The person that I want to be able to face looking in the mirror. Think about your own character. What I found, by the way, is 18-year-olds have not thought much about character. So the first assignment in my class is to write a description of the kind of person you want to be. Not what you want to do, but the kind of person you want to be. And think about what kind of actions you have to do in order to become that kind of person. We're really good about careers. Not so good about character. Fifth question is ask the liberty question. How do I show my respect for the autonomy of other people? The fact that other people might have different choices. The fact that they're free. Or when I do this with students who I have from Japan, how do we do this as a corporate freedom for the autonomy of the group? The sixth question is the question of empathy. it seems that we have built into us a kind of empathic response to others, especially to their pain and to their pleasure. And it has to do with mirror neurons and other kinds of features of our neurology. But as we grow older, that seems to fade away as we become more adult and more professional. Remind people, what would you do if you actually cared about everyone in this situation? It's not asking for an inventory of who you care for. It's asking you to think about caring for the people you don't care for. 7, ask yourself the question of authority. Are there legitimate authorities here? And the authority could be the law, but it's not always legitimate. It could be expertise, but not all experts are equal. It could be your religious tradition. Here, if you have a question like, what would Jesus do? That's a fine place for this question. But then you have to figure out, well, where did I even figure out what Jesus would have done? Right? How do I get to that point? Was it just something I heard? Or is there a good reason to think that this is what Jesus would have done? And finally, ask yourself the question of rights. Are there any kind of groups that are being discriminated against here? Are there rights that have been enshrined in important documents that are important to recognize? Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, I have students look at that. And we have the Bill of Rights and other kinds of rights that we talk about in our society. Ask yourself the question of fairness, outcomes, responsibility, character, empathy, character, liberty, empathy, authority, and rights. It takes a little time. Do it in a group if you can. The value of doing it in a group is you actually find out that your view of those things isn't the same as everyone else's. And other people might have a kind of perspective on fairness that you missed. If you have a question about Black Lives Matter, get into a group in which you talk about fairness with people who are black. It'll give you some better perspective on how to do this. Help people with their decision making. Don't tell people what to do. Help people make better informed choices. That's what we're working with. I lost my clicker. Can we begin to dance here? Claire? It's a computer problem, not a clicker problem. What we would do is use some scenarios. We use it with students, we use it with you. We're still locked up. Tell me when we're not locked up if we ever get to that point. But we are? Okay. What we do, we try to use these scenarios. What we do is recognize two things. One is recognize the tendencies we have and the research we have about how we make decisions. Take that all into account. We have all kinds of, by the way, biases. A bias is simply a limitation of knowledge based on the limitations of our experience. Since none of us are omniscient, we're all biased. And so, since we don't see things from the perspective of God, we actually see them the perspective from Bill Hawk here in Harrisonburg, Virginia. I have biases that I have to recognize. They're limitations. And what I want to do is try the best I can to overcome those limitations. Think about all those kinds of things. And I have a bias. I can just confirm what I already believe rather than to look for new evidence, for new things to believe. We have lots of these things going on inside of us. Recognize those and then go through a process. The process of asking questions. The questions help us focus on important ethical considerations. When we did this, we tested it with people who teach ethics, various places, and they said, the response was, I can't think of anything you've missed. We've tested it with people, at least on our faculty, who are from different cultures. We asked, in your culture, is there a fairness consideration? Yes. In your culture, do people worry about outcomes or results? Yes. They might talk about it differently, they might frame it differently, but they still have those considerations. What we're doing is, from my perspective, instead of helping you build your barn, or instead of helping you recover from a hurricane, helping you make a better choice. It would have been nice if these high school kids in Cleo, Michigan had a course to think about what I do before I go out and overpass. It'd been nice if those 48 white-collar criminals, 15 of them, by the way, were graduates of Harvard Business School, had they had a process to go through questioning. It'd be nice if we in the church had a process that we went through. In addition to the admonition, which is great from Paul, take on the attitude of a servant. How do you do that? Well, you think about fairness. You think about outcomes. You think about responsibility. You think about character. You think about those considerations that we as a human community and species have come up with so that we recognize that, yeah, we have been made with sufficient to stand, to have stood, but with the capacity to fall. And what we have to do is recognize our capacity to fall and try to stand as much as we possibly can. Another example, by the way, when this is done, and this is done after we presented our work, well, I can ask you a question. What's the third greatest cause of deaths in the United States? Heart disease is one. That's the first. Cancer is two. Suicide's not it. It's a good guess. It's medical errors. Think about it, folks. You try to avoid heart disease, of course. You take all those drugs. Try to avoid cancer best you can. You get treatment after the fact. What about when you go to the hospital? It's the third leading, somewhere between, some estimates are at Johns Hopkins estimate of 250,000 people a year. Other estimates have been as high as 400,000 a year. Recognizing that phenomenon, not only in the United States, but around the world, the World Health Organization, under the leadership of a doctor named Atul Gawande, who's now the head of the medical group put together by Amazon, Berkshire Hathaway, and Jamie Dimon's group is JP Morgan Chase. And he worked with 8 hospitals around the world, and in actually doing this experiment. They came up with, on the upper right-hand corner here, or that, what's called the surgical safety checklist. The surgical safety checklist is actually 3 sets of questions. The first set, on the left, is the set of questions after you've closed the operation room door. You ask before you actually begin the operation. The second set of the questions you ask during the operation. And the third set of questions are the questions you ask after you've completed the operation, before you open the door again. What they found was, they ran the study in South Carolina and around the world, 8 different major hospitals, different socioeconomic levels. There were hospitals in third world countries. They dramatically reduced the amount of morbidity and mortality post-operation. Simply asking the right question. The biggest resistance came from the surgeons. Because the surgeons, of course, are sort of the master of the operating room. But those surgeons they were able to actually convince that you should ask these questions actually had a reduction in mortality and morbidity. It's actually modeled after what was done during World War II before they started flying airplanes, where you had a checklist of things you have to check before you fly. They still use that checklist in airplanes. But what we now have is a checklist for ethics. A set of questions you should actually focus on. Think about what it would be like for everyone in the world to go through life thinking about fairness. Everyone in the world to go through life thinking about outcomes and responsibilities and character, liberty, and empathy, and authority, rights. Would that change the way we live? Absolutely. Would that be a service to humanity? I think it would. I think it would. Would people welcome it? Some wouldn't, because some already got it right. Some don't need help, right? So they think they don't need help. That's what we're trying to do. You ask all 18 questions. We have our go-to questions. Some of us tend to be, I have libertarian friends who would only ask the liberty question. Right? There are some of us who are basically empathy people. The morality of care that came out of nursing is actually sort of the profession of nursing is kind of an empathy kind of profession. That way. Or you can, some of us are responsibility people. My father was a military person. I grew up with this notion of responsibility. Pretty strong, pretty powerful, hard to overcome sometimes. You can actually, some of us are outcomes people, the policy people among us. There's tend to be outcomes people. A lot of us are fairness people and justice people. I assume a lot of us in this room are fairness and justice. Those are important things, but what's really important is make sure you look at it from multiple perspectives, bringing into mind both consciously and non-consciously the associations we have with these kinds of considerations. How am I on time now, Gene? 8:30? 8:32? I don't know. I want to read these tough cases or not. Gene, can you read this one? I'll have you. Yeah, you can see it. This is the kind of scenario I do with a student. This is taken out of the news, by the way. Back there.
Cassandra, a 17-year-old
Mike?
Hodgkin's lymphoma in September. Doctors projected an 80 to 85% chance of survival if she took the prescribed regimen of chemotherapy. Cassandra refused to consent to the chemotherapy, not wanting to have her body injected with toxins. Were Cassandra 9 months older, she'd be legally an adult in Connecticut. Presumably, as an adult, her refusal of consent would be decisive. She could refuse treatment. Since she is a minor, her parents are presumed to act on her behalf. In this instance, Cassandra's mother sided with her daughter, and will not consent to the chemotherapy. Not as a legal, but as a moral matter. Should the hospital recognize Cassandra and her mother's refusal of chemotherapy? Cassandra's prospects for surviving Hodgkin lymphoma are 80 to 85% with chemotherapy, 0% without.
Thank you. Tough issue. I think it's a tough issue. Had she been a little bit older, she could have refused, and what she would have done was gone home and died. Since she was underage, in terms of adult age in Connecticut, she was under 18. They asked her, she said no. They asked her mother, she said no. By the way, if you're a parent and you're putting your child's life in jeopardy, the courts will take away your authority when the child's life is at stake. Which what happened in this case, they actually forced Cassandra into chemotherapy. But when I present, and when we present in classes, or we present at JV, we present it as how do you make this decision? You have to think through the fairness issues, the outcomes issues, the responsibilities issues, the character issues, the liberty issues, the empathy issues, the authority issues, and the rights issues. They all come into play. Pardon me? I should be the next one. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. And you can do it this way. I had a colleague who did this one because I can't use that technique. What do you think about that? Pretty fancy. And you use those questions to actually think through whether you should treat Cassandra. And what we're trying to do is help our students who leave our campus to have a strategy for making informed choices. I used to teach, before I taught this, I taught critical thinking. And we had a student who left JMU, and this is not part of the politics of Jesus community, but this student went to NSA. And when JMU was starting a new program in intelligence design, I went to Fort Meade in NSA, by the way, which is the most scary places to have been in the world. It's a really strange place. But anyway, the student wrote back from NSA, she said, I got here and found out they don't have a strategy for doing decision making. And I thought, that's terrible. I don't know, I'm not really wild about what the NSA is doing all the time, but what I want them to do is to have a strategy. What I want my neighbors to do is to have a strategy when they make ethical choices. And I think what we all want is for each and every one of us to have a kind of strategy. Remember what Paul said, but then do it. Try to make the best informed decision you can, given that we have been made just and true and fair, just and fair. And what we can do We could have stood, but we tend to fall. Ask all 18 questions. Make sure that we're doing this to interrupt our natural inclination to sort of jump to a conclusion. Kahneman, one quote on Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is the human mind is an instrument designed to jump to conclusions. Do that in ways that we will try to avoid the risks that are out there, know that we're tending to see things from the point of view of my side, to confirm what I already believe in my group. I'm trying to privilege my own group. I've got all that stuff going on. Part of my biology, I recognize all the biases, and I try to do that and recognize those biases. Make it open questions and not justificatory questions, not just rationalize what I already believe, and do that in a group, especially where there is an outside perspective. Here I advocate for those students of mine who are from the Catholic tradition, the really insightful history of the Advocatus Diabolus, the advocate of the devil, who actually needs to be a part of this process, so you can think through all the implications of what you're about to do. Again, if you go online, you can look at this, I can show you the overdose case. We've done, I don't know how I'm going to make this available to you, but there's this fascinating stuff about World War II I use sometimes, about after they broke the Enigma code, which was the code the Germans were using to send all their communications around the world. And after they broke it, then once they broke it, they couldn't actually act on it, because if they acted on it, then the Germans would know the code had been broken. There's a powerful couple of scenes from a movie called The Imitation Game, which actually features a story about Alan Turing, who was the computer guy, and Joan Clark, who was the mathematics genius of this team, and the kind of decisions they might have had to make. But that's what we do in our classes. We go through that, we can try to think through these things. Let me just tell you one last story about how this is being used or might be used in other places. We mentioned my son works in the Department of Commerce. He's actually part-time now, half-time, working with a cross-agency group at the federal government level on data science. And my son reminds me that the government has an incredible amount of data about me, and said, someone could find out how you have spent all your money for the last 20 years. Anything that made it into a check or a credit card is available to the U.S. government. And I said, can't be. He said, it's all there. And there's a powerful amount of data that the government has in different agencies. And now what they're trying to do is to actually bring that data together across the agencies, which would give the government much, much more power. And the question becomes, how do we design an ethical approach to do that? I told him, try 18 questions. And he took that back to his team, and then they started looking it up, and they found out there are people who've already done this using kind of questions that we have. And what they've done, this is the book that they put out. This book is actually free and available online. It's open access. It's about the question we should be asking for data science. What you should do, if you're in a profession, from what we're doing, is to think about where in your profession are the likely places where people are going to make ethical mistakes. And then come up with questions, like they did with the World Health Organization Search and Safety Checklist, to make sure you think about not making those mistakes. And what they've done with data science is come up with a series of questions that data scientists should use. The series actually aligns with fairness, outcomes, responsibility, character, empathy, liberty, authority, and rights. We can actually sort of see these specifications of those questions with respect to data science. On campus, we try to encourage people to remember the 18 questions by putting up posters. The magic of a good decision comes from the questions you ask. Remember, we've been made just and right, with the capacity to have stood, yet we fall. We do service to each other, I think, following the admonition of Paul in Philippians, to not look for reputations, but take on the attitude of a servant. The servant is someone who helps others. And one way to help others is to help them make better decisions. That's the work that I do. I'm open for any questions you may have.
Bill, tell us about your forthcoming book.
It does work. I have a book on 8 key questions. Ethical reasoning, 8 key questions. Put against some of the material that will be provided. And the material will be, I'll have a chapter for each of the key questions on how to think more carefully about fairness, how to think more carefully about outcomes, etc. Because it's, just to say what are the outcomes doesn't really help us. It's really difficult. And this keeps going in and out, but that's what we're working on. Do some background on other situations in which people have taken what I would take to be the heart of a profession or the heart of an activity and captured it by questions, and then helping people to remember those questions when they're in that activity.
Who's publishing it? When's it coming out?
I don't have a publisher. My view is this. My view is I want to use it with my class and refine it before I have a publisher. So that's what I'm working on now. We work on particular chapters in my classes that I teach. So that it's accessible to students and also accessible. We have a couple of clients at the university that we work with. We have a company that we work with up in Rockville, Maryland. The company sets up clinical trials and biological research. It's a big government service agency. They have 500 employees. They work mostly with NIH, Department of Defense, Johns Hopkins, and private pharmaceuticals, and they're having all their employees go through one of our workshops. And so we want the book to also be available to people in the corporate world who are making decisions. But we don't have a publisher. But I'm still working on it.
Okay, question?
Yeah.
Hi, John Fairfield. I'd like you to inject 2 things in your thinking and respond with those 2 things injected. The first one is groups. Groups don't make decisions in the same way that individuals make decisions. And institutions often a person who is in an institution will behave very differently than they would if it was their own choice, if they weren't representing their institution. So that's one thing, groups. The second thing is trauma. When I look back at decisions that I have made that have been bad, there haven't been because I haven't thought of all of these things. It's been because of trauma that has made it impossible for me to correctly evaluate some of these. And I think we all have little corners of trauma, and certainly as groups even, we can have a very traumatized past that can make it very difficult to process. So please address those two things.
Oh, those sound really easy. No, thank you, John. That's really helpful. The group thing is really important, and we do encourage groups, and we know that groups do make decisions differently, but we think the groups actually are affected if they use a strategy like the 8 key questions. For a period of time at JMU, the senior administration had a table where they all sat, all the vice presidents and the president and provost, those folks, and it had a glass top, and under each seat at the table they had an 8 key question card. Just to remind them of that. And what has happened in recent years is our provost has become the advocate for the 8 key questions. And whenever they're making a decision at the group level, at the president's office, they're trying to use the 8 key questions there. I think it'd be valuable for groups. I don't think there's any cure-all for the fact that groups tend to be like-minded. But I think the idea of trying to make sure that you have at least one person who you can count on to be a kind of question raiser of the questions is a really valuable thing. Or having someone, designate someone who can be the outsider for your group. If you get a group of people who all think alike, you're going to make bad choices. Just as an understanding. The trauma one is really difficult, and I think you're absolutely right. I recently had a discussion we had a guest. We're taking the these 80 questions to Rwanda. And we know that in Rwanda they've had trauma, but they're actually coming through it pretty well. And we took a leadership team to Rwanda. They took the 80 questions to their universities there, and they want to use them in the university there. And we're trying to do that as well. But it really is difficult, especially immediately after a trauma or after a trauma that has been life-changing. It's hard to come up with this kind of process. The best kind of process, I think, for someone who's been in trauma is to find other people who can help them do the reasoning through the process. Because we know that once you've experienced serious trauma, it's tough to make any kind of well-informed choice. Is that satisfactory? I mean, trauma, it does make things. I think you can count on your hand lots of times in American history where leaders of the country have made really bad choices because of some kind of trauma. I worry about it right now, actually, and I've worried about it in the past. I think a lot of what could have been attributed to President Bush happened because of the trauma of 9/11. And I don't think that good decisions were made as a result of that trauma.
Thanks, Bill. Rick Yoder.
Yeah, Rick.
I really like this. No surprise. It fits my left brain, my dominant left brain. But we're more than left brains. What's your response to that?
Wait, what was the second part? It fits your left brain, but what's the but?
The human condition is more than being a left brain.
It is. It is.
There's a whole lots of other parts of us. How does this deal with that and making good decisions?
Well, I think the left brain part of it, or the more intuitive part of our brains, are really, really important. I think they're active all the time already, Rick. I think that this is a kind of, how do I say this? It's a kind of equalizer in some respects, rather than, I don't think we'll ever become people who are totally dominated by right brain thinking. I think that's what our right brains give us, a kind of equilibrium when it comes to making decisions. The evidence from the research, I believe, suggests that we tend to be quick-brained people. And they tend to be emotional people, which is not bad. What we're trying to do with the 18 questions is actually reshape our emotional responses. We're trying to reshape our intuitive responses. What we want to do is to have people go through the world looking for fairness. We already have a disposition toward fairness. For those of you who don't know, there's fascinating research on how fair we are born. There's a lab up at Yale called the Morality of Babies Lab, where they actually study 5-month-old and 6-month-old babies and find out that 6-month-old babies have a preference for fairness. Franz de Waal, who does this work with animals, mostly monkeys, has shown that animals of all kinds have a built-in notion of fairness. What we're doing is simply reminding people to look for it, rather than trying to put it there. We're trying to remind people to look for outcomes. It's just a series of reminders that affect us both consciously and affect us non-consciously. What psychologists call it, they prime and they prompt. And that's what we're trying to do. I don't think we'll ever become anything other than what we are, which is, in many respects, emotional beings. Does that help at all, Rick? No? Yeah.
I'm trying to bring balance.
Trying to bring balance.
That's right now. I'm trying to bring some left brain.
That's exactly right. That's a little bit right, yeah. Except for remembering people, the empathy question actually takes you back the other way. Don't forget the empathy question. Yes, right here.
And there are two questions yet, and then in fairness to everyone, we're going to call the formal part to a close.
Okay.
And if you have a few minutes, people can check individually with you.
Okay.
So we'll get two more questions here.
Yeah, Vern Sherry.
Okay.
This was very much based on us having free will. Have you read, I'm sure you have, the Adrian Rain Anatomy of Violence and Abigail Marsh on fear, who have done functional MRIs and who conclude that free will is overplayed?
I don't want to overplay free will here. I just want to play for the fact that we have dispositions that can be tapped. right? In terms of the key questions. I haven't read those books, by the way. I don't read as much as I used to because I just can't get to it. I can. It does assume that we can do the kinds of things that Paul suggested that we do, or the kind of things that Milton actually, I think accurately said, that we have the capacity to stand, but we fall. If we don't have the capacity to stand, then I don't know, I'm not doing the right kind of thing. I'll tell you what, when I hear the stuff about free will, I worry about, aren't we just justifying and rationalizing the bad choices we've already made? Is it the case that those kids in high school back in Cleo, Michigan could have done something different? I think absolutely. Is it the case that those 48 white-collar criminals could have done something different? Absolutely. What could have changed it? If they would have thought about it, deliberate about it, stop and think, rather than go with, oh yeah, this would be fun to throw rocks in cars, or this would be fun too, or this won't be fun, but this would be a way of helping my company by changing the accounting practices. I think the kinds of things we're talking about here are things that we can correct in some ways.
Okay, one
One more. Got it right back there.
Yeah, Ruth.
Ruth Jones.
Hi, Ruth.
I wanted to say, it's a little bit of a follow-up to Rick's question, but I think there are enough situations where there is often literally not much time before actions are taken or must be taken or inevitably will be taken, or situations in which persons don't even recognize this is an ethical situation. So given that, it seems to me, actually I have two questions, but this is the first one. It seems to me that in those many instances, we do act based on who we are, what we bring to the situation at that point in our lives, and that points to something that a community man and I were talking about, faith formation. So what has formed you up to that point so that when you're instantly faced and act instantly, more or less, what are the impulses? I've been impressed sometimes to see someone who, with an Anabaptist background, receiving something bad from a person, the instant response is sorrow or compassion toward that person for having done that to me. That's novel. That's because somebody brought something to the situation. And I'm interested in how these 8 points, pointing each of them back into what can we do as we, within Christian communities or within communities generally, whatever context we're addressing, build in things that will bring people where they're acting on the instant, in some sense, bringing something to it. Very, very few people, I'm sorry, but I believe very, very few people will really plod through these points. I find them helpful, and I find them really to look back on sometimes, and I have recognized that I had a decision to make. The second thing, so that's one question, but I'd like your comments. But the second thing is just looking at things where our society recognizes we're doing awful things, say with criminal justice and incarceration. There are and individual people feel bad who are part of it in some way. It is very, very hard to determine who the ethical actor is in situations where there are so many levels, such a complex system, that no one is able to take responsibility for looking at the questions you're raising. But my first question, I think, is the one that I'm most interested in.
The first question is a good one. I think we won't change the fact that our immediate response will be an immediate response, and it will be a response that actually replicates our past. So that if you come from an Anabaptist background and you come from a past that has taught you to look with compassion to people who take attitudes different from yours, that's going to be your first response. And my response absolutely is the case that if you have an key question card and pulling it out, you might not have time. But if what your goal is not just to have an key question card, but to have people develop the practice of asking, looking for fairness, looking for outcomes, looking for responsibilities, looking for those considerations, that becomes the background condition from which you operate, so that it doesn't take a lot of time. And I can tell you from my own personal experience, that's the way I look at the world. And I have a colleague now who is actually saying that he is actually seeing the world that way as well. You walk into a room, you walk into a situation, your intuitive response becomes one of looking for fairness, outcomes, responsibility. So we're actually looking at it as a formative process, not simply a process at the end. It's more difficult to do that with groups, but I think a culture of a group could actually be shaped that way as well. Now what we do here is we do considerations of the character of this group, the outcomes that we're producing, that can all become a part of it. Now the second part of your question, Ruth, again was, remind me a little bit about that. I was fascinated by your first part because I think we're trying to do exactly what you said people do. We're trying to actually make this a form.
Yeah, it was about the difficulty of recognizing who is in the position.
Yeah, that's difficult.
Complex social problems.
Yeah, those are complex problems, and the part of the problem is we do all have, and not just those persons who we don't identify with, all have a disposition toward justifying and rationalizing what we have done and distancing ourselves from responsibility. So what we want to do is to make sure that the responsibility question is held up as a clear question all the time. And hold up to Henry Kissinger, you can't say things like mistakes were made, perhaps mistakes were made during the administration in which I served. You can't go into a Catholic priest and say, if there were mistakes, I deeply apologize. There were mistakes, and you were responsible. I think all we can do is continue to hold people responsible. And maybe if they actually ask that responsibility question, they'll come to recognize that sometimes I just need to own up to what I've done.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you all for being here. And